Hi, it's Mary Pat from Just Add Students. Thanks for joining me. We're going to talk about 7 strategies for teaching students how to write effective summaries. We know that writing summaries is challenging, and one of the reasons it's so challenging is because there's not always one clear answer for a summary. It's not something that's easily seen, and we as teachers know when we see a good summary, but it's hard to teach our students how to write effective summaries. So let's go over some strategies. Before we hit the strategies, I want to just remind you of a couple teaching tips that will help you. The first is to practice, practice, practice. This certainly is not a one and done skill. You also want to focus on the big ideas. So your students are going to continue to look at what the big idea is. You might want to spend some time talking about what it means to get the gist of something. You want to scaffold texts. So in other words, start with easy text that your students do not have to worry about comprehending, and then you can increase the difficulty of the texts. Make sure the texts they're summarizing are long enough and include details. It can sometimes be very, very difficult to summarize just one paragraph, but it might be easier for your students to summarize a fable or a short story. You want to give your students practice with fiction and nonfiction. And oftentimes it's easy for your students to talk with a partner and verbalize their summary before they write it down. And you can also practice as a class writing your summaries together. That helps build confidence in your students. I encourage you to use familiar texts, simple texts like picture books, summer reading, fairy tales, things that your students aren't going to have to struggle with comprehension. They're just simply going to be focusing on the summary. And of course, we want to focus on writing an objective summary, which is really an important part of this as well. So let's get started on the strategies. The first strategy is to teach the why. So there is great value in your students knowing how to summarize and why they're summarizing, why is it important, and what they get out of it. So summarizing will help improve their comprehension. It will vastly improve their ability to identify and isolate important information, not getting bogged down in the details. It will help with retention. It will aid them when they're doing research. It will strengthen their study habits. And finally, it improves critical thinking. So the next strategies, once your students understand why you're asking them to summarize, we want to have some strategies of how they're going to do it. So the first one is to analyze some bad strategies and fix them. And we know that middle school students enjoy finding things that are wrong, so they oftentimes will enjoy this kind of a learning task. So it is kind of fun to find some bad summaries, and you can actually write bad summaries for your students, and they don't have to know you've written them, of course, but they can analyze why they're weak summaries and what can be done to improve them. And this is helpful because it reinforces looking for big ideas and not getting bogged down in the details of the text. So you also want to include examples of summaries that are not objective so your students understand what it means when you're asking them to write an objective summary. And then you can finally, when you're looking at bad summaries, ask your students what would make this better, and that can even be a lesson of having them improve summaries that are not good summaries to strengthen them. Next strategy is to compare and contrast different types of summaries. So we know that there are all different kinds of summaries, and that's what makes this a difficult skill to teach. So when students see a variety of summaries, sometimes it helps them not be so worried about what they're writing because they see that there are various ways to write a summary. And it also helps them distinguish what qualities are in a good summary. So just as an example, in this resource that I created, I have 3 different summaries for Little Red Riding Hood. and one too short, one too long, one just right, and then the students can evaluate what makes them good and what makes them ineffective. And then I have a nonfiction piece, again, with 3 different summaries. So practicing summarizing fiction and nonfiction is a really important practice skill for them as well. The next strategy that you can use to teach summary is to use beginning, middle, and end. So this is really works well for longer texts like a chapter summary. And your students are basically going to be writing about the big idea at the beginning, the big idea at the middle, and the big idea at the end. And you can even have them separate the texts physically, mark out the pages, or draw lines on the text if it's a couple pages where they have to say, okay, this is the beginning, this is the middle, this is the end. What's the big idea here, big idea here, big idea here. It can also be helpful if you use a sentence requirements. You may say, I want you to write 2 sentences at the beginning, 2 at the middle, and 1 at the end. Sometimes that helps students feel a little bit more secure, feel like they know that they're writing enough. This is also a great activity to write as a class, or you can even just divide the text up into chunks and distribute that among your groups of students and have them summarize their section and then pull them all back together and create your summary as a whole class. Again, another great activity that helps build writing confidence. The next strategy is somebody wanted but so. If you're not familiar with this strategy, it's often used in analyzing fiction. So this works really well with fiction text. And it's basically somebody, so who's the text about, wanted, what's their motivation, but what's their conflict, what was keeping them from getting what they want, and so what is the conclusion. So this is a good strategy to try out with your fiction texts. The next strategy is the 5 W's and the 1 H. And this is similar to somebody wanted but so, because your students have specific things they're looking for. They're looking for the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the text. So it will help them focus on what they need to do. The drawback of this particular strategy is that sometimes students may not connect their ideas. They'll just kind of answer the who, the what, the where, the why, and how, and they aren't going to necessarily create a summary paragraph. So you want to make sure that they're using transitions. And you also need to give them clear instructions for the how, because sometimes they can be difficult. For the how is a little bit more vague, and so they may need a little bit more support with that. The next strategy is to limit the words. So this is a really challenging way to teach summary, and that's why I left it for the last strategy, because you're asking the students to understand what the big idea is and then cut it down to a specific word limit. So they're actually doing 2 different pretty complex things at the same time. So you may want to start without a limit and then ask them to subtract words as they go. This is a really helpful strategy for students who have difficulty including or excluding details, and it's very helpful for the student that's afraid not to include some information. So you're actually asking them to go back into their summary and determine what are details that are not essential to the big idea. This is also a really great whole class activity. It provides a wonderful discussion points for what is essential to a summary, when is it too long, and when is it just right, and what do I need to cut out. You can decide how many words you want for the word limit. You can say 50, 30, 20. I wouldn't go any lower than 20, but some of that is going to depend on what the text is that they're summarizing. But it's a fun exercise to get students thinking about what really is the big idea if I have a word limit. But again, it's a little bit more advanced strategy for your students as they're becoming more comfortable with writing summaries. So if you still need help, you can always contact me at marypat@JustAddStudents. You can also check out my post on my website, which is 5 Ways for Teaching Summarizing Skills. I have two resources in my store. One is objective writing. I showed you a little sample of that earlier. And then another one is where students actually create a graphic novel summarizing, which is a really fun, creative way to practice summarizing skills. I'll include those links in the video. I'll include the links from this video below so that you can look at them if you're interested. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope that this little video was helpful to you and that you feel more confident in teaching summarizing skills to your students.